the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Monday, July 27th, 2015. As Greece's economy continues to be crippled by austerity measures, we'll examine what happened to the Syriza Party with my guest, Dr. Richard Wolff, the acclaimed Marxist economist. And author Allan G. Johnson shares his story of struggling with race, privilege, and nationality in a memoir called Not From Here. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Saudi Arabia is continuing its devastating air war against its impoverished neighbor Yemen. On Saturday, the deadliest airstrike of the war so far killed 120 people, including women and children. The strikes were aimed at a power plant in a residential area. So many lives were lost that bodies were buried in mass graves on Saturday. A spokesperson for Doctors Without Borders told AP it just shows what is the trend now of the airstrikes from the coalition. Now it's a house, it's a market, it's anything. Saudi Arabia, which is the major player in a U.S.-backed coalition, announced a ceasefire, which was to have begun at midnight last night, but fighting continued to rage on the ground between Houthi rebels who have taken over the country and Saudi-armed Yemeni forces. Rahul, there was almost no U.S. coverage of this devastating death toll from the airstrike over the weekend, and even the UK's BBC, which did report it, put the number of dead, 120, in quotes in the headline. Is that because it's our friends doing the killing?
Well, with 1,700 at minimum civilians killed, this is certainly something that deserves more news coverage, although, of course, it's competing with a lot of events in that region. But that's not quite how I would say it. I think what happens is that it's the nature of the victims that determines how much coverage there is. So there is no reason in any American political discourse that Yemenis matter in the least, or are perceived to matter. It's the nature of the aggressors that determine what's the character of the coverage. So, for example, if it's our allies, then the military operation will come to seem natural or beneficent, even without specific words being used. If it's, say, Palestinians being killed, it's often hard to tell from the news article who exactly killed them.
And President Obama continues his tour of Africa this week, arriving in Ethiopia today after his visit to Kenya. In Ethiopia, he met with Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn for several hours in a closed-door session. Ethiopia has been a vital U.S. ally in the fight against the Al-Shabaab militant organization in neighboring Somalia. Still, Ethiopia faces its own struggles with human rights violations, including the unjustified detention of journalists. Earlier, during his visit to Kenya, where his father hailed from, President Obama made a lengthy speech veering into personal territory. It was the first time he has visited Kenya as president and called himself the first Kenyan American to be president of the United States. He also used his platform to demand that Kenya respect gay rights, a direct snub to President Uhuru Kenyatta, who referred to the issue of gay rights as a non-issue. Well, Rahul, how does the president of the U.S. come off lecturing African countries on anything, given that U.S. policies in Africa, even under Obama, have been quite destructive?
It's odd enough for a president who discovered he was in favor of marriage equality only yesterday to be lecturing Kenya about gay rights. But if we look at the larger picture, we don't have to go very far back in history. Just think of the 2006 Ethiopian invasion of Somalia, which was fully backed by the United States, and in which estimates are that possibly as many as 16,000 people were killed. It was against a militant extremist organization, the Islamic Courts Union, but of course the invasion and occupation actually only served to spread Islamist jihadist sentiment and organizing in the region. The United States backed that. It was the Bush administration that did it, but Obama hasn't repudiated it and has effectively owned it, just as he's owned the invasion of Iraq. With that kind of record, the United States is certainly the last entity that should be lecturing other countries. It's occupations like that directly often lead to domestic human rights violations like those Ethiopia is dealing with now.
And finally, here in the U.S., the body of Sandra Bland was laid to rest on Saturday in Lisle, in Illinois, just outside Chicago. The 24-year-old African-American woman became the newest symbol in the fight against police brutality after she died within 3 days of her arrest in a Texas jail. The New York Times' Charles Blow described her funeral as celebratory and defiant. Ironically, as the national convening for the movement for Black Lives met in Cleveland, Ohio over the weekend, they were met with an incident of police violence. As Cleveland cops targeted a 14-year-old African-American boy for arrest after slamming him to the ground, Black Lives Matter activists confronted the cops on the streets. A white officer was captured on several videos, calmly pepper spraying dozens of people in the face. The boy was eventually released to his mother after being treated for injuries. Rahul, how clueless are American police that they continue to behave like thugs even when there's so much of a spotlight on them?
Well, I'm trying to imagine what kind of briefings are being given in police departments these days. And as far as I can infer indirectly, I think the only thing they're really focusing on is they're probably saying, make sure you don't get caught doing any of this stuff on camera. But we already know anecdotally that what that amounts to, most of the time it doesn't make any difference because they're so used to doing what they're doing. When it does, what it often means is officers decide to turn off their cameras instead of actually changing their behavior. And yet we do know, we have a clear example of what can be done if the kinds of briefings and the pressure are right. And this is even in the absence of direct criminal accountability. Look at the Baltimore uprising or riots, whatever you want to call them, after Freddie Gray's death. Even though that involved, among other things, crowds of black kids throwing stones at cops, the police never felt so terrified of the situation that they responded by killing anyone. Whereas in other circumstances, apparently a developmentally disabled man clutching a fork is deemed, a sufficient threat for the police to pepper him with 10 shots. In the case of Baltimore, they had clear instructions not to kill anyone, and they didn't.
Rahul, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Greece was rocked with reports over the weekend about secret plans by a faction of the anti-austerity Syriza Party to possibly transform the currency from the euro to the drachma. Former Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis and former Energy Minister Panagiotis Lafazanis gave separate interviews over the weekend, revealing that a Plan B was set into place months earlier in case Greece needed a way out of the eurozone quickly. Varoufakis lambasted some media reports for giving the erroneous impression that he was plotting against the state so as to justify charges of treason against him. Negotiators from the EU are expected in Athens this week to discuss details of a new bailout plan to the tune of 68 billion euros. Joining me now is Richard Wolff. He has written a number of books, including Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, Occupy the Economy, Challenging Capitalism, Imagine Living in a Socialist USA, and Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, essays on the global economic meltdown. He is an acclaimed economist. Welcome to Uprising, Richard Wolff.
Thank you very much, Sonali. Glad to be here.
Now, news media are using the words humbled and capitulation to describe the current state of the Greek crisis. Is it too soon to use these words, or is it pretty much over? Has the much vaunted anti-austerity Syriza Party been forced to give in?
Well, the answer is, as usual with good questions, a little yes, a little no. Is it a defeat for Greece? Absolutely. It was a decision led by Mrs. Merkel in Germany, but with the agreement of most of the leaders of Europe, that they are going to impose a savage austerity on the Greek people. They are going to literally destroy a small, poor part of Greece in order to force it to do two things. One, to pay back all the debts that were pushed onto Greece in the years, particularly since the crisis of 2008, but before that as well. And secondly, to carry out the notion that austerity, making the mass of people pay for the costs of economic crises and bailouts, is the way Europe has decided to deal with its problems. It is awful. It is an attempt by the rich to destroy the poor by making them pay for the problems of the system and doing it without any compassion, without any mercy. Let me give you a clear example that I think will help Americans. When the crash hit here in 2008, it began with the incapacity of millions of Americans to pay their mortgages. They had borrowed more than they could afford because their wages had not risen in any real way for 30 years, because banks had inveigled them with all kinds of illegal and immoral activities for which they've paid a few small fines recently. And so masses of Americans found themselves ripped up between an economy that wouldn't pay them anymore and the debts that same economy put on them. We made a few half-hearted efforts in this country to help the people who couldn't afford their mortgages, but millions of them lost their homes with the traumatic effect on their wages, on their family life, on their children's education, things that we will be suffering from as an economy for years to come. The thing that happened in Europe is exactly the same, except instead of focusing on people who couldn't pay their mortgages, it's been organized in a national way. Imagine if all the subprime mortgagees who couldn't pay were Greek citizens, had some common ethnicity. They didn't, of course, in this country, but that's what's happening in Europe. You're focusing on a particular country, Greece, and trying to smash them by saying to them, we fooled you into taking loans you couldn't afford, we kept down your wages so you couldn't afford them, and now we're punishing you for not paying back, and we're going to make you pay back, even if it means your ruin and the ruin of everyone associated with you for decades to come. It is a very tragic moment in European history.
Now, Richard Wolff, the government spokesperson who has been credited or tasked, I should say, with justifying the situation to the Greek people, Lefteris Kretsos, gave an interview where he essentially said austerity is bad, but bankruptcy is much worse. So that's the big question. Would bankruptcy have been much worse?
Well, you know, it's one of those wonderful questions we'll never know, at least for the moment, because they didn't dare try. I think a more honest answer would be to say that, led again by Mrs. Merkel in Germany, the Germans and the rest of the European leadership were prepared to starve Greece out, to literally deny the people and the businesses of Greece the money, the euro, which is their common currency, needed to do everything from buy a quart of milk at the store, to run your business, to help a friend with a check, whatever needed money. They were basically, as Mr. Varoufakis correctly said, they were asphyxiating the Greek people financially. So what you forced the politician there to do was to choose between doing what they want in the way of austerity, cutting wages, cutting salaries, cutting public services, which is what they've now agreed to do, or going into an unknown situation where you would have to try to figure out, with very little time, how to substitute a whole nother payment system for the fact that the euro would be no longer available to the Greek people to use.
And so that actually brings me then to this question of what you make of this plan that was revealed over the weekend that had been apparently worked on and put into place by Varoufakis and a small group of folks, kept super secret, where they essentially tried to create the infrastructure, and I think might have successfully created the infrastructure for a parallel economy that would, with the flip of a switch overnight, have switched from the euro to the drachma, at least theoretically, with very little, problem and with problems with transition. What do you make of this news?
Well, again, it is a bit of a tempest in a teapot. Let me explain. Every government that has even a little bit of a sense of history and responsibility has the task of trying to figure out how to plan for as many contingencies as are reasonable in its own future. For example, the American Defense Department makes contingency plans for probably bombing or invading virtually every country on this planet in order to have those plans available if, and that's the big word, if political and economic and military conditions put that on the agenda. It was the responsibility of Mr. Tsipras's government, as indeed it was the responsibility of governments in Greece before Mr. Tsipras and Syriza, to have in place contingency plans so that a government that had to make difficult and perhaps sometimes time-pressured decisions would have the knowledge of how to go about doing it. Not to do that is irresponsible. All that Mr. Tsipras and Syriza did through the finance minister, which was the right way to do it, was to say, look, there is a chance, and boy, is this true, and everybody who follows this knew it, if there's a chance that the Europeans will push us to the brink, try to force us into this austerity policies they prefer by literally taking away our money, our euro, our access to the euro, we ought to have a plan B. We ought to have a way to deal with that. And so what the plan B was, and there Mr. Varoufakis used an American economics professor, James Galbraith, from the University of Texas in Austin, to help him design a possible way if the Europeans chose to take away the money, and if the Greek government in response chose to move to another currency, that they would have the way, the mechanisms, the understanding to do that. There's an added wrinkle. When you change from one currency to another, it has to be done in secrecy and suddenly. You can't tell people and businesses that you're going to change from one currency to another, because what they then all do, what all Greeks would have done who had the capacity, would be to stock up on euros as much as they could, pull them out of circulation in order then to cash them back into the new currency once it was established. That would have made the shortage of euros for the economy to function 10 times worse, literally overnight, and would have brought to be the very asphyxiation the Europeans were doing slowly in a quick way, and that's why it was kept secret. I should also remind folks that in the history of the last 50 years, when countries in various circumstances have substituted one currency for another, it has always been prepared in secret, and it has always been done suddenly, precisely because of these risks.
Now, we have been covering this situation in Greece for a long time. In fact, the last time you were on our program in studio, we started talking about it quite early on when the Syriza Party won its election. And they were elected because of the promise that they represented to the Greek people, because the sense was that the Greek people had basically been pushed too far. The situation in Greece being compared to that under the U.S.'s Great Depression. If it's true that they have been pushed as far as they can be pushed in terms of austerity cuts, and if the troika of creditors are now imposing even harsher austerity cuts than they first offered to Greece, How is that going to go down, practically speaking? I know that some of the details haven't been worked out yet, but the troika of creditors are standing pretty strong. But can the Greek people take any more?
Well, that is the $64 billion, or maybe these days I should say $1 trillion question. The way to understand this, I think, is to go for a minute to a different place, but it's the same issue. Imagine you're sitting in a room full of the board of directors of some large corporation. If you go to such meetings, as I have done a few times in my life, you very quickly understand that there are basically two opinions. One opinion of the board of directors is we can push and squeeze our workers forever. They are pliant, they are cowardly, they are fearful for their jobs. So we can take away their benefits, we can cut their pensions, we can reduce their lunchtime to 20 minutes, we can allow them less than 2 times to go to the bathroom during the day. We can make them work harder and harder, and there's no reason for us not to. It will enhance our profits. On the other hand, there are always, or almost always, at least a few members of the board of directors who reason in a different way. They look at their fellow members of the board of directors and they say, don't be foolish. You can push people so far. We have pushed our workers quite a ways, and we're doing very well and making a lot of money. You are going to push so hard that you are going to go across a line. No one knows exactly where the line is, but you're going to push our workers to the point where they're going to revolt. And then it's not going to be a question of us getting a little more or a little less profit. You're going to throw the entire enterprise's survival up for grabs. So take a good profit, be glad that you've squeezed the workers successfully as far as you have, but don't push further. What the Greeks did with Europe, they assumed that there were enough people in the leading councils of Europe arguing that you've pushed the Greek people far enough, you've made them suffer, you've given them a 25% unemployment rate, you've cut the wages of public employees, who are the majority in Greece, by over 40% since 2010, etc. That's enough. Don't push them further, because it is going to make them into a revolutionarily angry group, and that will infect the similarly suffering Spanish people, right, Portuguese people, and so on. And the mistake that the Greek government made was and by the way, workers make this mistake all the time. They misunderstand that there are simply, in these days, not enough of the kinds of friends on the board of directors as opposed to enemies. What they learned, the Greeks learned in Europe, was that Mrs. Merkel, her finance minister, Schäuble, these are people who have no intention of giving up their sense that they're on the ascendancy. They've been pushing people around in Europe nicely now for 15 years. They're not about to stop, and they brush aside the more hesitant European leaders, for example, the socialist Hollande in France, and will have nothing to do with him, and they have the majority. And so the question is only how far further will they push the Greeks, not whether they will, but how far they will, and at what point the Greek people, and indeed the Spanish and the Italians, will say no. And there are already signs, particularly interestingly in Italy over the last 3 days, in which leading politicians are beginning to say, hey, if this is the way Europe is going to work, given what it's done to Greece, maybe it would be wiser for us to get out now before they do it to us as well.
Well, let's talk about another people, and that is the American people. Richard Wolff, you're in New York, where a major victory was won last week when the Fight for 15 campaign in New York, which was sort of the birthplace of this wave of activism demanding higher wages for fast food workers, was born. And in New York, statewide, a measure was adopted to raise the wages. In the city of New York, wages would rise faster to reach $15 an hour. How important was this victory?
Well, I think it has two important consequences. The first one, which any decent person would applaud, is that it takes people who have very hard jobs and get paid very little and makes them less awfully paid than they were. To live in New York City, for those of your listeners who are not familiar, is a very expensive proposition. Prices in New York City for a whole range of things are higher than they are anywhere else in the United States. So to be honest, one has to say that to do a 40-hour-a-week job and earn $15 an hour is going to make you have a difficult economic road to hoe. To earn less than that is an indignity to the human being that should never have been allowed in the first place. So I am happy that people who should have been paid more than this are at least going to get the $15, which living in New York City, and for that matter in New York State, but particularly in the city, is just a matter of basic human decency. But even more important for me is that this was a campaign that was roundly dismissed by all kinds of people as hopeless, impossible, much too ambitious, not taking into account that people don't want to get active politically, they are not in a mood, they're fearful of losing the job they have. 800 reasons, very old, very stale, very frequently repeated, why such an effort wouldn't work. So for me, who sees so many other efforts like this screaming for the same kind of response of people, I am very happy and believe that this will inspire others. Let's remember, for example, that there are many people who earn below $15 an hour, but that do not work in the fast food industry. They are not yet covered by any comparable political agreement. So they're immediately, obviously, in need. But even beyond that, let's remember that, to raise the wages of a person, however valuable and important, and of course we all support it, still doesn't change something very fundamental about our economic system, which is that a tiny group of people at the top, the boards of directors and major shareholders of corporations, are making all the decisions, including the decision of how much to pay people, for the vast majority. That is an anti-democratic arrangement.
Which is why the second part of that demand, which is for a union, has not been won. It was fight for $15 an hour and a union, right?
Exactly. A union would help make the following a reality. If you allow the people, the tiny group of people at the top, to make the decisions, then even if you win, as has been won now, $15 an hour, it would be naive not to understand that those boards of directors and those major shareholders, they will be going back to Governor Cuomo in New York and to the legislature. They are not going to stop because they lost this battle and not continue to fight the war. They may move production out of the city. They may find ways to escape all of these rules. That's what they do, and they have the resources to do it. So working people need not only to have a higher wage, but they need to have some security about that, and a union will give them at least a little more than if they don't have a union. But I would like to make the further point that if we had, and I think we need the courage now to demand this, if we had a democratic way of organizing businesses so that the majority of people would be in a position in a working place to control these things, then it wouldn't be in the hands of people we know don't want to do this for us because they haven't for years, who we know will try to undo whatever we win. If the people themselves in cooperatives and things like that operated and owned the work sites, the workplaces, we wouldn't be in this absurd position where we have to struggle and strain to get things that should never have been that low in the way of wages in the first place.
Dr. Richard Wolff, I want to thank you so much, as always, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonali, and my congratulations to you for having the courage to put these issues forward for people to listen and think about.
Dr. Richard Wolff is a visiting professor in the graduate program at the International Affairs and teaches International Affairs at the New School University in New York. His books include Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. When an angry mob of racist Americans confronted Central American immigrant children in the town of Murrieta, California last year, they held signs saying "Return to Sender." But the ownership that citizens claim upon the United States of America is rooted in an erasure of history and the extermination of millions of Native American people. In a memoir entitled Not From Here, author Allan G. Johnson explores the idea of belonging to a land to which you have emigrated. When his father passed away and he needed to decide where to scatter his ashes, Johnson began a journey that was both geographical and philosophical. Allan Johnson is a sociologist, author, novelist, and public speaker. His books included The Gender Knot, Unraveling Patriarchal Legacy, and The Forest and the Trees, Sociology as Life, Practice and Promise, and Privilege, Power, and Difference. He now joins me to discuss his new book, Not From Here. Welcome to Uprising, Allan.
Thank you, Sonali.
Now, your book begins with a tragedy, the loss of your father, and then it develops into a conundrum, which is where to scatter his ashes. Why was it so confounding for you that your father actually himself didn't quite care where you scattered his ashes? Why was the place of scattering so important for you?
Well, when I first asked him, which was before he died at the age of 93, he said it didn't matter to him at all where his ashes were. It didn't really surprise me. It wasn't a conundrum. He lived all over the world. He was fluent in multiple languages, so it wasn't shocking to me that he might be indifferent to that. But then 3-4 years later, I still had this box with his ashes in it and didn't know what to do with them. And of course, I felt some obligation to do something with them. But for the first time, I realized that I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know where there would be a piece of land where they would belong. And then as time went on and I kept sitting with this problem, I realized that I didn't know of a piece of land where I would feel like I belonged. And so what started out as fulfilling what seemed to me just to be an obligation to one's father became a journey for myself as much as for him.
Now, why did you not feel like you belonged? You, I'm assuming, were born here in the United States.
Well, there are lots of kinds of belonging, which I didn't realize until I had taken this very long road trip, almost 2,000 miles. I feel belonging in relation to my family, for example. I feel belonging in relation to my community. But what this turned out to be was a journey over land, and the question coming up of to what land do I belong? What people am I a part of that is identified with and in some ways defined in relation to a particular land? And I realized that there was no such people that I belonged to that belonged to the land in that way. And by belonging to the land, I mean that you look at the land and you see yourself reflected back in some way. Or you look at yourself and you see the land in your face, in your body. Many indigenous peoples in North America have identified themselves in relation to particular kinds of land. And that's something that I became aware that I don't have access to.
Now, your father was from Norway, and like all immigrants to the U.S., your father had a story about why he came to the U.S., where he came from. And did that figure into your journey to figure out how and where to scatter his ashes?
It did. He was born in the United States, as was his father. His grandparents emigrated from Norway and became farmers in Iowa. And when I realized that I was wanting to find some piece of land where both the father and his son would feel like they belonged, I began the journey in South Dakota, which is where my father ended his childhood. I mean, he went to high school in South Dakota, and then I worked my way backwards to Minnesota, where he was born, and then finally to Iowa, where his father was born and his grandparents emigrated. So that for me, this was the only possible way in which I might find a piece of land that would speak to me in both ways, both for my father and for myself.
Can you read a small portion of your book for our audience? The book is called Not From Here, a Memoir. And I think you say it better in the book than I could bring it out, just in terms of how you draw the connections between this journey that you took and trying to understand the history of the United States.
I'd be happy to. This is before I begin the journey, and I've collected maps. I look at my maps of Iowa, Minnesota, and South Dakota, land soaked in blood, spilled in taking it away from peoples who had lived on it for thousands of years and wanted only to go on as before. I have not been searching for that history, which came up briefly and almost by accident. I have been looking for a link between myself and what I imagine to be the land of my ancestors, the people of my origin, wanting to imagine, needing to. D. Brown writes that the Indians knew that life was equated with the earth, which I think means you cannot understand a life without knowing the land it came from and where it was lived, because the two are one and the same. But I grew up in a society that looks upon land as a temporary place to live, to set up shop, a resource to be seized and controlled and exploited, ruined if need be, in pursuit of wealth and power. The last thing that would occur to us is to look upon the land and see ourselves, or to look deep into our own eyes, our faces, the lines that etch our lives upon our bodies, and see the land. I am a white man, born and raised, the land therefore a mystery to me, making me a mystery to myself. And if Native people are right about the land, then it is not a sort of mystery to be solved like an engineering problem, but instead something that can be known only through the body. And for that, the body must be on the land. What I know about my ancestors and the land has come mostly through books, without the urgency that I am feeling now in these days before I set out on this journey in the middle of my 63rd year, in a way I never would have imagined, through the body of my father.
Allan Johnson reading from his book, Not From Here, a Memoir. Now, your book is a very personal book, and in your earlier writings, you have dealt with issues of privilege, of gender privilege, of racial privilege. How is this book different from your earlier writings, and why?
It's different in that it's the first book I've written that's about me, on some level at any rate, that tells a story about a journey that I myself took. That's the biggest difference. In a couple of ways, it's also a combination of the things I've done before. In my novels, I tell stories, and in my nonfiction work, I've tried to understand how social life works, particularly in relation to issues of privilege and oppression. And this was a book that brought both of those things together. So in a way, it brought two very distinct parts of me into the same narrative. So I'm both telling a story, but it's not simply about me or about my dad. It's also about the larger context that our stories are part of the larger story, if you will.
There have been a lot of histories written about what the U.S. has done in essentially what the history of the United States has really been in terms of the extermination of Native Americans. Of course, those histories don't necessarily enter mainstream discourse, nor are they necessarily taught adequately at the high school or even college level. Is your book an attempt to bridge the gap between the academic history and people understanding it from a personal level? Because, of course, we are all complicit if we are not Native American ourselves.
Yes, my sense is that for me to understand what I think of as my own story, or even my father's own story, I have to understand it in a larger context, because it doesn't exist otherwise. There is no Allan Johnson, for example, except as a participant in a larger story that extends backward in time through history. So if I want to know who I am, I need to know the story of which my life is a part, and the history of this country, including the horrific parts of that history, are part of, if you will, the web that holds my individual story along with everyone else's individual story. So I don't think it's possible to really understand my own life or anyone's life, and certainly not our lives collectively, except in relation to these larger stories. It's a both and. We have to do both.
So your grandparents came, or your father's grandparents came from Norway, so your great-grandparents came from Norway. So that's several generations in the United States. But everybody comes from somewhere, right? So this question of belonging, does it become a matter of where you place the threshold of how long your family has, how many generations your family has been on a certain land?
It's a really good question. I wish I had a nice, simple answer for it, but I don't. My own answer for that question is that the kind of belonging I'm talking about is not possible simply as an individual. I use the word indigenous a great deal to think about this. In order for me to feel indigenous to this place, to this land, a particular piece of land, I have to identify myself as part of a people who are themselves indigenous to that land. And I think, as I understand the word indigenous, what it means is it's to be from someplace in the sense of ultimate origins, deep origins. As a North American, as an American, I come up empty around that because, first of all, there is no American people that I can say, these are my people. These are the people I am from. There is no American ethnicity. And not only that, but the people that are in North America, other than Native Americans, are not from here. We speak the English language, but very few of us are English. Actually, none of us are English except for recent immigrants from England. So there is no sense of my being part of a people whose origination is on this continent. And I don't think you have to, I don't know how, 10,000 years from now, I suppose that might change, or even 1,000 years from now. But certainly now, none of us has to trace our lineage back very far before there is this disconnect, where going backwards farther are people who are from somewhere else, who are indigenous somewhere else. So my great-great-grandparents were indigenous to Norway. Actually, my great-grandparents were indigenous to Norway. They were Norwegians. But then everybody going up to now, including myself and now my grandchildren, we are not indigenous to Norway. I'm not a Norwegian. I could never be accepted as a Norwegian in the way that a Norwegian immigrant could be accepted as an American. So there is this disconnect for all of us. And the question is, how far back do you have to go for that disconnect to happen? And you have this, what for me was this strange realization that I have ancestors who belong someplace where I don't. And I think that's a key part of the American story.
Right, a key part, and of course not all of it, because not only were there people who were always here, and then there were people who were brought here forcibly,
Yes.
and today there are people who feel compelled to come through economic hardship, and actually even earlier waves of immigrants felt that as well. You can compare, for example, poor Europeans with poor Central Americans today as well, and all of those are pieces of a larger story of which you write your own personal part.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, you mentioned it, I brought up the issue of the threshold of how long does one have to be someplace to really be considered from here. There was a recent new scientific study that was just published that concluded that all of the various Native American tribes in the United States were found to have descended from Siberia. When they came to this continent, that was 23 1,000 years ago. And so this is it goes back to this issue of everybody does come from somewhere, does migrate from somewhere. How long ago that migration is happened is a question, I suppose, that one can take up when one tries to understand what belonging means.
Yes, and I expect it's much less of an issue for Norwegians in Norway than it is for.
And also then there's the issue of displacement, right? Because when you come someplace where there already have been people, where there already have been people living for millennia, and your coming ends up displacing, dispossessing, and exterminating, it's a different. And when I say you, I mean the collective you, right? It's a different kind of migration and creates a different conundrum on the issue of belonging than people coming to a land where there was nobody to begin with necessarily, or people coming to a land without displacing and simply integrating.
I think it's called conquest.
Yeah, let's say it.
That's what we did. That's how we acquired, how Europeans acquired North America, was through conquest in all the ways that gets accomplished. I mean, peoples have been moving for, hundreds of thousands of years. And Norwegians came from somewhere. But as you point out, when they got to Norway, there was, as far as I know, there was relatively little conquest and forcible displacement going on.
Now, you say in your book that, quote, what is going on in this country is about race, and in one way or another has always been about race. And this is an issue that we are grappling with today, more so than in the last few years. And I'm wondering if you can expand on the fact that so much of our history does have to do with organizing along racial lines and and conquest, and the dynamics between racial groups being about domination and extermination and violence.
If you look at the history, my reading of the history of the United States is that the concept of race as we know it today, especially the concept of whiteness, has a relatively short history. It doesn't go back that many hundreds of years. And it was used as a way of justifying both the seizure of North American from Native Americans, as well as the institution of slavery. And that's where it came from. And so since the seizing of North America was necessary for the United States to even exist, I mean, there would be no United States if the land was not taken from Native Americans. And since the capitalist economic system as we know it was largely driven in the 19th century by the economics of slavery, race is at the center of our story. There's no way to avoid it. And then, of course, once you put in place the ideologies that allow the white population to think that they're doing everything by right because they're superior by virtue of being white, once you put that in place across many generations and give those generations a material investment in that being true, then you've created a monster, which is what all of us have inherited. Each generation of people in the United States of all races have inherited some piece of this monster.
Now, light-skinned immigrants coming to the U.S. have had the luxury of simply becoming white, and we've heard the histories of how the Irish became white, how the Italians, etc. But in becoming white, didn't they also lose something important, which was their own ethnic heritage? Doesn't adopting whiteness also come with a loss?
Very much so. When I went to Iowa, at the tail end of my journey, I went to the land offices. I wanted to see the actual records of my great-grandparents buying this land. And I ran into this whole mystery of naming. There are multiple versions of my great-grandfather's first name. He changed his last name. The last name he was born with was Mokastad, which is Norwegian for the home of the seagulls, basically. It was the name of the place where he was born. He became Johnson. And the only reason he became Johnson was because he wanted to be accepted as a newly minted American. My grandfather was born with the name Johann, but he didn't die with that. He died with the name John. So there was this complete cut, I wouldn't say it was complete in that generation, but there was this progressive cutting loose of any sense of where they were from. And it began with my great-grandparents. My father, his full name was Valdemar Nels Luther Johnson. But he was born with the name Niels, not Nels. I have a little baby book that was filled in right after he was born. There's no doubt about it. It was Valdemar Niels Luther Johnson. So I realized at some point my father decided that Niels was not the name for him. It was Nels, which is a more Anglified version of Niels, sounds less foreign. So to me, there was this progressive process across generations of obliterating, in some ways, their origins. It was not as powerful for my father because he was raised in a household where they spoke Norwegian, which is why he was fluent in Norwegian, which is very unusual, I think, for a third generation to still be speaking English at home. But he had that advantage, so he grew up fluent in 4 dialects of Norwegian.
Now, of course, today, in some parts of the country and among some sectors of society, we see these attempts by white Americans to celebrate white culture, not Norwegian culture, not English or Irish or Italian culture, what they might be able to trace as part of their own roots, but what they call white culture. And of course, they say, if blacks can have Black History Month, why shouldn't whites have that same sort of thing? That's not what you're talking about when you talk about reclaiming heritage, right?
No, I would say there's no such thing as white culture, except perhaps a white supremacist culture, but white culture that encompasses all of Europe, I don't know of any such culture. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead and finish it.
I was going to say whiteness is a dilemma. I had this come up in a class years ago. I was teaching about race. And white students in the room were somewhat distressed that people of color were asserting a certain pride in being of color, and they wanted to know, was it okay to be proud to be white? And my response to that was that it was really problematic, because it makes sense that people of color who have been denigrated and oppressed on the basis of color for so long would say, well, we're going to turn this into a point of pride. That makes perfect sense. But if you look at the history of whiteness, it has no significance. It's not real, except as an invention, a cultural invention that served the purpose of defending and justifying white privilege and all kinds of horror. So it's to be proud of that, that I should be proud of how my skin color gets categorized doesn't make any sense to me. I haven't done anything. And it's a dilemma. And I think it's a dilemma that white people in North America, we simply have to live with it. It's part of the legacy that's been passed to us. There's no simple solution to it. It can be painful, and that's part of the deal.
And can rediscovering your own ethnic heritage as a white person make you, as well as, of course, familiarizing yourself with the history of the Native American genocide, with the history of the of American institution of slavery, all of that contribute to people understanding about white privilege and becoming more sensitive to issues of race? Are those pieces of a puzzle that people can start exploring?
I think so, and I also think it's not simply a painful exercise. My experience of doing this work over a long period of time, number of decades, is that denial doesn't work very well. Not living in reality is not a good life strategy. So that as difficult as it can be, especially initially, to open myself to the reality of the history of this country and how my ancestors and therefore myself, by extension, are involved in that history, that's not all bad news. Because as difficult as it is, I also have the benefit of knowing who I am, knowing what was passed to me, knowing that it wasn't my fault. I didn't create any of this. None of us alive today created any of this nightmare. But now it's been passed to us. And for me, it is in some ways, it's liberating to be able to simply acknowledge the fact of the whole story of this country, the whole story of the people that I came from, and the loss that we have suffered as a result of that. If I don't know what has been lost, then I can't respond to that in my own life.
Finally, Allan Johnson, we started our conversation and you started your book with trying to figure out where to scatter your father's ashes and the journey that took you to across the United States. Can you give our audience a brief sort of summary of where that journey took you and whether you feel like you found some peace and maybe gave your father some peace?
The journey started in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I rented a car and drove across Minnesota into South Dakota. And I wound up unexpectedly driving a good portion of the ways across South Dakota and then back again, visiting places that I knew from my father that he had experienced. And I wound up in Iowa. This was almost 2,000 miles, this journey, with my father in his box in my knapsack on the seat next to me in the car. It was a very quiet journey for me. I realized after I got back that I never once turned on the car radio in 10 days and 2,000 miles. Never even occurred to me. So that I was crossing land in a state of not only solitude, although in some ways my father was keeping me company, but also silence. And I think the silence was essential for me to be able to hear what the land, for one thing, I think was saying to me repeatedly, which was not a hostile rejection, but it was saying to me, this is not where you're from. And this is not where your father is from. And as that message sunk in deeper and deeper, and I crossed land that I knew the history of, I came deeper, I think, into questions about who am I? Who are we? Who is the we of which I'm a part? Where are we from? And in many ways, I came home with those questions still. I didn't come home with some epiphany and answer to all these problems, because I think, frankly, that my understanding of the place of all these questions in my life as a white person in North America is that how I live my life now is my response to these kinds of questions.
Right.
How am I going to be an American citizen, knowing what I know, not only about my family, but about my country?
Well, I want to thank you very much, Allan Johnson, for spending this time with us, and good luck with your journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonali.
My guest, Allan Johnson, is a sociologist, a public speaker, and novelist, and we've been talking. He also writes nonfiction. The latest in that category is his book, Memoir, called Not From Here, that we've been discussing. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Kristen Beck is our production coordinator. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.